Hello, language learners of the internet. Anyway, can we learn language automatically? Like, if we're just around a language a whole bunch, do we magically acquire it? Well, actually, yeah, kinda. I mean, it's not magic, but it is automatic. Most of the language we learn happens automatically, whether it's your mother tongue or a new language you learn later on in life. So in today's video, I want to answer one main question. Since language acquisition happens mostly automatically, why do so many people struggle with it? Hello, and welcome to Lingua Carpa. I'm Carp. I speak 3.5 languages, something like that. And I've been helping people acquire different languages for over 13 years. So to answer today's question, and hopefully to better prepare you as a language learner, we will review 4 tenets of language acquisition that I think anybody interested in learning a new language or anybody already trying to acquire or learn a new language really needs to know. Tenet number 1, language acquisition happens through communication, not direct study. People, like humans, unlike Mark Zuckerberg, have been communicating with spoken language for at least tens of thousands of years. Well before written language appeared somewhere around 6,000 years ago, that means we've been using speech to communicate as humans for tens of thousands of years without learning it in a classroom with a textbook or even without Duolingo. Curious. So how did we all learn languages? Simply through using them to communicate. It should be no surprise that communicative language proficiency, being able to communicate, is built better through communicative learning, for example, using the language to communicate about something, than it is through grammar study, that is, directly studying the grammar of the language and then trying to build out things from there. Again, this ought to make sense because for most people, language is a tool we use for other things. It is not usually the goal in and of itself. Por ejemplo, no aprendí español simplemente para poder explicar la gramática española. Lo aprendí para poder comunicarme en español con otros hispanohablantes, para viajar, compartir experiencias, expresar mis necesidades, y más. Which brings us to tenet number 2. Language acquisition happens almost entirely automatically, incidentally, and implicitly. Let's break that down a little bit. Automatically, meaning we acquire most language without the need for it to be directly taught or explained to us. We do not or could not manually or consciously put every single piece of information for how a language works into our brains. Next, incidentally, meaning acquisition happens as a consequence of communication for other goals. Despite what we may think as language learners, the learning of the language is not the ultimate goal in itself. We intend to learn it to use it for other things. Therefore, communication is the goal, and the language acquisition is a side effect, a consequence of that. And finally, implicitly, meaning it largely happens without conscious awareness. Our brains take in and process incalculable amounts of information at every moment of every day, but only a minuscule fraction of that information gets our conscious awareness, focus, or attention. Much like when you're watching this video, your vision is consciously focused here, but there's all sorts of things happening in your peripheral that information is coming into your eyes, but you're not focused on that. You may be completely unaware consciously that it's there. That does not mean that you don't see those things, though. So, with all of that said, let's consider the following. We cannot control what our brains learn or hold on to at any given moment. However, when we have language-rich experiences, like chatting with someone about a shared interest in a new language, our brains pick up on the components that we make meaning out of, that we understand. Maybe when I'm having a conversation with a French speaker and I tell them, "J'aime jouer la guitare," he might smile, point back at himself and say, "Ah, moi aussi, j'adore jouer de la guitare." Now, in that moment, I may pick up on the moi aussi, along with the speaker pointing to himself, and register this as meaning me too. And while most learning is implicit and incidental, I may become consciously aware that, that's what that term means. That means me too, or me as well. Or I may implicitly pick up on the way the second syllable of j'adore was stressed for emphasis. My brain can notice that whether I consciously pick up on it or not. That means that later I'm likely to reuse that same phrase and vocal emphasis without knowing exactly where or when I learned it, but it's now available in my subconscious language system. And at the same time, the subtle detail of adding de la into the phrase the native speaker said is something I may have noticed, but it probably didn't carry enough meaning or importance for my brain to have held on to that for later use. That means I'm probably not going to confidently be reusing that partitive article in my own speech anytime soon. I will need a lot more practice and repetition with something more subtle like that before my language system fully acquires it, and I don't really have the power to tell my brain, this is the one time you hear it, and now you're going to permanently remember. I don't. Otherwise, we do that with everything. All I can do in that scenario is keep giving myself opportunities for genuine communication to allow that acquisition to happen. Now, as a side note, yeah, you could say, I really need to learn that one grammar point and drill the heck out of it and memorize that structure. There's a time and a place for that, though I think that's seldom. And really, what you're doing there is forcing yourself to manually process something so that when you need to reproduce that structure later, you're going to have to stop and manually think about, how do I form that? I got to take the verb, cut off the ending, put in the other ending from a different form of the verb to show that this is subjunctive now, so that when I put this whole phrase together, it sounds correct to the native speaker. You don't have time to go through all those hoops while you're talking. So that would make you crazy, inefficient, and a very slow communicator. Okay, that was a lot for tenant 2. Let's get to tenant 3. Tenant 3. Real communication provides rich context where we are consciously aware of a few language components, such as tangible vocabulary, but where we are subconsciously aware of a multitude of other communicative variables. That would be things like complex parts of speech, rate of speech, tone, pauses, emphasis, body language, volume, facial expression, and on and on and on. This is why, like in my previous example of j'aime jouer guitare and j'adore jouer de la guitare, real communication allows us to learn holistically, instead of just focusing on filling one blank in one sentence on one page of a workbook without any context to real life or something that we actually care to communicate about. So things like that, like a workbook, don't provide real communication. It doesn't provide real life context. It doesn't show me the facial expression of the other speaker. I don't get any vocal intonation. I don't see the relaxed body language of this person that I'm sharing an experience or an interest with. And so here, workbooks, textbooks, and every damn language learning app all fail in the same way. It's not real communication. You are 100 times better off watching YouTube videos, reading books, playing video games, having a conversation with somebody, messaging a friend. It doesn't matter. Communicating in a real capacity. And yes, real communication goes far beyond just having a face-to-face conversation. That's why I mentioned things like reading books or playing games or watching videos, because in those cases, we are still using language as a tool to access something else, some other knowledge. We're using it to communicate. If I'm watching a video about somebody, maybe I'm interested in where they're traveling during a vlog. If I'm reading a book, I could be interested in that story or in that author. Or if I'm playing a video game, I'm interested in learning about the plot or getting through a puzzle, something like that. We're still using it as communication. Tenant 4. If you had to learn everything explicitly and directly, there would be no hope of ever reaching high proficiency or applying language in real life. This is our last tenet. So not only would you need to know all of the right vocab and grammar rules, and I mean all of them consciously, oh my God, which is nearly impossible to do, but you'd also need to be consciously aware of everything we already mentioned as well, like the rate of speech, tone, pauses, emphasis, volume, body language, facial expression, and everything else we already talked about. The thing is, you certainly don't do this in your native language, and you certainly would not want to. If you speak native English, for example, of course, you'd have to know all of the grammar rules, which you don't. You do not consciously know what all of English's grammar rules are, though most native speakers follow nearly all of them. Nearly. We still don't speak perfect English. Nobody speaks their language perfectly unless they're some super ultra language prude. So you'd have to know all of that, and you'd have to apply that to every sentence or thought that you want to get out, whether you're speaking it or writing it, before you even say the thing or try to do it while you're saying it. And anybody who's tried to mentally and, let's say, manually construct a sentence in a new language, one word at a time, while you're trying to have a conversation, knows that that does not work. It is just terribly slow and inefficient. So that's never going to happen, which raises the question, why are so many language programs, textbooks, and apps focused on this learn all of the grammar rules approach? Or maybe more specifically, learn all the grammar rules and all the vocab out of context approach, not using it to actually communicate about something. They are set, for some reason, on making you a grammar master and a flashcard master. So now that we've discussed our 4 tenets, let's return to the question for today's video. Since language acquisition happens mostly automatically, why do so many people struggle with it? If you think you know, if you have an idea, pause the video in a moment and write your answer in a comment. Okay, ready for the answer? Most people learning a language are using a class, book, or app that does not use real communication, denying our brains the most natural way for us to automatically acquire language, and arguably a much more enjoyable way to acquire language. When I meet people and tell them I'm a language teacher, I hear things like,
"Oh, cool. I've been learning Spanish on Duolingo for a year now."
Or,
"My girlfriend and I took 2 semesters at the Community College of French before our trip to France."
And these comments are usually immediately followed by an admission that they were completely unable to communicate upon arrival or interaction with the target language and culture. And it's not really their fault. And just a side note I wanted to add while editing here, look, people turn to what seems familiar and accessible when they're interested in learning a language. And popular apps or classes are things that people are aware of without being experts in language learning and without really knowing where else to look. You can't be blamed for that. One big reason I make my YouTube content is to change that and help people find a better, more enjoyable way, or ways, because there's a lot more than one, to learn languages that really sets them up for satisfying success. Now, I pick on things like Duolingo because it's well known and frankly, it's easy to pick on. But just as we discussed, this is the case for any context, any educational context where they're trying to make you learn the language directly instead of using it or teaching you to use it as a tool to communicate. So please, if there is one thing you take away from today's video, let it be this. Language is learned automatically, incidentally, and implicitly as a consequence of using it to communicate. And like I said, it doesn't matter if that communication is reading books, messaging a friend, having a face-to-face conversation, playing a video game, watching a series. But it has to be about using the language as a tool for communication, not dissecting the language itself. And really the only people this doesn't apply to are people like scholars or linguists, other people who actually need to be grammar experts for their field. For the rest of people, and I would argue the vast majority of people who are trying to learn another language, it's because we want to use it to communicate about other things in life and work towards other goals. And that's it. We did it. That's the whole video. Thank you for making it to the end of the video today. And please leave me a comment about your language learning journey, or if you have any questions about language acquisition. Obviously, I have other videos. That's what the whole channel is about. But I do love hearing from people and being able to help directly, especially if you're curious about something. With that said, thank you once again, and I will see you all in the next video. Look at this guy. He hasn't learned any languages. You don't know nothing. You don't do nothing.